56 years is a long time to remember a promise. Long enough for a war to fade into books, for soldiers to become grandfathers, and for memories to blur like ink in the rain. But for one man, time didn't erase the past. It only deepened it. In a quiet Ohio town, the late afternoon sun spilled softly through thin white curtains. The air inside smelled faintly of pinewood polish and coffee. Sitting near the window was Peter Mathews, 79 years old, a man who had fought, healed, and carried something from a lifetime ago that he could never quite set down. Beside him sat a wooden trunk, edges dulled by decades of touch. Inside were his folded uniforms, a fading photo of his unit, and one small object wrapped in cloth, a worn notebook with its corners bent and its color almost gone. Every year, around the same time, Peter would open that trunk. He'd pull out the notebook, sit in silence for a few moments, and whisper words only he could understand. This wasn't nostalgia. This was a ritual of remembrance and of guilt. He had found the notebook during the Vietnam War, back in 1969. He'd been a medic then, young, determined, exhausted, and scared in equal measure. His job was to patch the living and send the dying home with dignity. He often felt like he was doing neither well enough. It was a rainy season near Da Nang. The ground was more mud than earth. Visibility was low, and the air smelled of smoke and metal. After an ambush, as Peter moved through the haze checking for survivors, he stumbled on a small satchel half buried in the dirt. Inside it, this very notebook, he remembered turning the first page. There were pencil sketches, a woman holding a child, two boys chasing a kite, a line written in Vietnamese script that he couldn't read. He didn't know the words, but he understood what they meant. It wasn't about war. It was about home. Peter slipped the notebook into his pocket, not as a trophy, but as a promise. He told himself he would one day return it, not to make peace with history, but to keep faith with humanity. When the war ended and he returned home, America felt like another planet. People had moved on. They wanted to talk about the moon landing, not about jungles and fire. He tried to bury it all, the memories, the smells, the screams that still echoed in his sleep. But one thing wouldn't let him forget: the notebook. He kept it in his drawer, next to his medals. Years passed. He married, raised two children, worked a quiet job, and grew older. But every year on Veterans Day, he would take that notebook out, place it gently on the table, and whisper, "I'll bring you home." His wife once found him doing that. She asked, "Peter, why you keep that thing?" "It just brings you pain." He smiled faintly and said, "Because it's not mine to forget." There's a certain silence veterans carry, one that never quite leaves them. Peter's silence was the sound of a promise unfulfilled. Decades slipped by. He grew slower, but the thought grew heavier. Who was the man who owned the notebook? Did anyone ever wait for him? Did a mother, a wife, or a sister light candles every year, still hoping for a body that never came home? Sometimes Peter dreamed of returning it. He'd wake up before dawn, see the trunk across the room, and feel the pull of something unfinished. But he didn't know where to start. Vietnam was far away, in distance and in memory. Then, in 2021, on a quiet February morning, Peter made a decision. He was 79. He wasn't getting younger. If he didn't do it now, the promise would die with him. He began with a letter, short, shaky, written with hands that trembled from arthritis. He sent it to a veterans group, then another and another. Weeks turned into months. Some replied kindly, but none could help. The war had been too long ago, and too many records were gone. Still, he didn't stop. He bought a small scanner, digitized the pages of the notebook, and posted them online, on a veterans forum filled with old soldiers who shared stories and ghosts. For a while, there was silence. Then one day, a message appeared in his inbox. It was from a man named Tran, a historian in Hanoi. He wrote, "We think the handwriting matches a soldier listed as missing in 1969. Nguyen Van Phu near Hue." Peter read the message 3 times, hardly breathing. The name felt foreign and familiar at once. Tran asked for more photos of the notebook. Peter sent everything he had, the cover, the drawings, even a note he'd found tucked inside, a line written in fading blue ink. Tran replied again, saying they had found something remarkable, Gwen Van Phu's sister was still alive. She was now in her 80s, living in a small village near Hue. Peter stared at the screen. For 56 years, the notebook had been a weight in his drawer. Now it had a destination. He printed the email, folded it neatly, and placed it inside the notebook, like a letter finally finding its way home. Then he packed a small suitcase. He didn't tell many people. He just said, "I've got something to return." The flight to Vietnam was long. As the plane crossed the Pacific, he looked down at the clouds, his reflection faint in the window. He whispered, "It's been a long time, kid." And for the first time, he smiled. When he arrived in Hanoi, the air felt thick and warm, like breathing through memory. The sounds were different. Scooters, street chatter, the rhythm of a country alive and at peace. He took a bus south toward Hue. Outside, rice fields stretched the horizon, and children waved as they passed. It was a far cry from the land he remembered. No smoke, no gunfire, just sunlight and laughter. When he finally reached the small house, a few people were waiting. Gwen Van Phu's sister, her daughter, and 2 grandsons. No cameras, no journalists, just family. They greeted him with gentle smiles. Unsure how to bridge the language gap, Peter opened his bag and carefully pulled out the notebook. He held it in both hands, bowed his head slightly, and handed it to the old woman. She took it slowly, her hands trembling. She turned the first page and froze. There it was, her brother's handwriting, sketches she'd seen him make before he left for war. Tears filled her eyes. She pressed the notebook to her chest and whispered something soft in Vietnamese. Peter didn't understand, but he didn't need to. Some emotions speak every language. The room was silent except for quiet sobs. One of the grandsons poured tea, his hands shaking too. Peter sat down, his own eyes wet. For the first time in over 5 decades, the notebook was home. Later that evening, they invited him to stay for dinner. They didn't share language, but they shared stories through gestures, pointing to old photos, passing food, smiling through tears. It was the kind of peace Peter had longed for all his life. The next morning, he asked if he could visit the river nearby, the same one where Nguyen had once fished as a boy. The family took him there. The water was calm, reflecting the pale morning sky. Peter brought a small candle from his bag, lit it, and placed it on the water. The flame floated gently, its reflection trembling across the current. "It took me 56 years," he whispered, "but I finally kept my word." The candle drifted away, smaller and smaller, until it was just a dot of light in the distance, like the closing of a chapter too long left open. For Peter, the journey wasn't about redemption. It was about connection, about the thread that ties all people, even those on opposite sides of history. He stayed in Vietnam for a few days after that. He visited a war memorial, placed a small flower by a wall of names, and closed his eyes. When he returned to Ohio, he no longer carried the notebook, but he carried something else. Peace. He kept the email from Tran framed on his desk, and beside it, a photo of the family who had welcomed him as one of their own. Sometimes, when visitors asked about the picture, he'd smile and say, "That's the day I came home, too." And every night before bed, he'd look at that photo and whisper, "Promise kept." Some promises live longer than we do, but when you finally keep them, they stop being